Today, the cage is done on the Class 2. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another Road to the Scale Nationals video. The Class 2 is heavily underway. We're making great progress on it. I feel good about it. The last 2 nights previous to tonight, I had started the rear cage, and then tonight I pretty much got everything finished. At least finished to the point where I think I've got everything mainly taken care of, but I'm going to continue the build, figure out the rest of it, and then make any notes of things that I want to get changed or fixed or, just added to it. And then I'll do everything to the truck as far as that metalwork goes at the very end, such as adding a stinger on the front and then any other mounting tabs or anything like that that I feel like I need to do. What we've done here is we built this rear cage, and I decided to film that most of the entire process. I'm gonna Rachel Ray you a little bit here. What I did was I ditched the GoPro. The GoPro gave me all kinds of just headaches this weekend with freezing while I was working on the Class 1 truck, and that was super annoying. So what I decided to do is use my Canon DSLR, and I set that up to film with. Hopefully we've got a better setup. I haven't edited any of that yet, so we're gonna find out how that came out during this video. But I went through and kind of went through the initial process of building this cage. So we'll jump into that, and then we'll come back here, circle back around how the finished product ended up. We've got it here on the fab table. I've got a new Northwest Scale Designs updated fab table compared to what I had been using. This is their newest version. We're not going to be using the actual jigs that comes with this setup just yet, but once we get to the Class 3, that's likely more when that will come into play. What we've got here is the MST body sitting here on the chassis, kind of mocked up about where I think that it's going to live. And from here, I'm going to start doing kind of a little bit different type of cage. I'm not going to do a full like B hoop or a roll bar in the back that follows the chassis. I'm gonna kind of do something more pre-runner style, where a tube just kind of comes up and would actually dive into the cage. Now that cage won't actually continue in through there just because it's a Lexan body and that's not feasible to make happen, but we're gonna make it look like it does at least. And then I'll probably do a little bit of reinforcing on the cab itself just so we don't get any tearing. Now in previous videos also I discussed that I was looking at doing a pinch to the rear, and I actually think that I've decided against that. With the style that I'm going for, I just don't think it was gonna be that fitting. So we're gonna keep it straight. As with the rest of the series, we are in a time crunch, so I need to get rolling. Now I did pick up some 3/16 DOM tubing from Stock Car Steel, which is 10 3-foot sticks, cost about $100. So I'm going to be doing a mixing of TIG brazing, that's using the TIG welder, and then actually using the silicon bronze filler rod. And I use 1/16 inch filler rod, and that is what I'm accomplishing. Then also I'll be using that new Detroit torch, and that's the DHC 2000. My TIG welder is the Razor Weld 160P. With the torch, I might be using a couple of different materials. One is that same silicon bronze filler rod that we use with the TIG welder, and the other will be actual silver solder that I picked up from Holmes Hobbies. And then I'll be using a little Stay Silv flux with that. The biggest thing that we need to get accomplished first is I need to get an outer hoop put together to get this thing supported. So I'm gonna try and match the outside shape of this bed rail as best I can. I'm planning to have a tube sit underneath of that cap. And then from there, we need to get that mounted to the chassis. So you can see there, the wall thickness is 0.035. That's thin, but not that thin. Still gives us a pretty decent wall thickness to work with. Now with that tubing, it is soft, and since it's hollow, it will actually kink or collapse when you're bending it if you try and bend it too tight. Now I've got here, this is my Oaken Shield Productions bender, and then it is mounted to a block of aluminum. It doesn't come with any mounting situation. You need to figure out your own for that. So for mine, I found this piece of scrap aluminum. You guys may not have just scrap aluminum like that laying around, but luckily I did. And then for the handle, you have to actually add your own as well. And I used a drumstick, specifically a Guitar Hero set drumstick. So, you know, the things we have laying around. But the thing about this bender is that the dies that it uses are 3D printed, and they actually fit to the radius of the tubing. That way it has a much better chance of bending it smoothly without getting those kinks and collapses. The normal bender I use is the BAC Industries Mighty Rod Bender. It's very crude and rudimentary and doesn't have anything like that. So if you try and work with that tubing on that bender, it will not work out that well for you. The first thing I'm going to do is measure the distance that I want the tubing to be. It looks like it needs to be about 166 millimeters wide. The radius on this bender is 1/2 inch, so we need to take that into account when we're starting and finishing our actual bend joints. So to start planning out our bends, I'm gonna take a look at the cab here, put my ruler in there and see where the tube needs to be on the back end. And it looks like I'm about 5 3/4 inches. Now, like I said, the radius on this bender is 1/2 inch. So I need to be at 5 1/4 where I actually start the bend. Since I'm looking at a 90-degree bend, you can basically use just that exact 1/2 inch. So 5 1/4, and then I'm gonna give myself an extra inch of just extra, that way I don't waste tubing. So I've made my initial bend there. I'm gonna check it at 90 degrees with a speed square. This is just a run-of-the-mill piece of construction equipment. This is a plastic version and it's orange, so it's obviously the one I have. Now you can see here that my bend is a little bit shy of 90 degrees, so put it back in the bender and get it squared up. For that one, I'm, if anything, just like a hair over 90 degrees. So we'll be able to get that kind of put back into place, at least enough so that I'm not worried about it being over. So with our first piece of tubing kind of mocked up in place, I can see that this radius is going to work well with this body. I feel comfortable about everything here. So now I need to confirm that distance between the two rails that I want. For example, I think I'm going to push it a little bit further out than I had thought initially. So at this point, I'm actually going to go more towards 6 3/4 rather than 6 1/2. I might shy a little bit on the narrower side just because I'll have some ability to kind of fudge the body that way rather than tapering it out. I'd rather always have it just a little bit inset. So I've got it at where I think the start point is, but now I need to line up this upright with the rest of the rod so that I feel that everything is in one straight plane. If I have got this at an angle laid over and then bend it, my two bends are going to be offset from each other and the tube's not going to lay flat, which I definitely need in this case. Put a little tension on the tube just to make sure that everything's holding where you want it, and go for it. Obviously we've got this extended portion of it, but we're just going to kind of lift up the body and support it a little bit, fake it in there. And what do you know, our tube is basically perfect. From this point, I'm gonna take and cut this tube to an equal spot on both sides. And then I'm actually gonna start mocking it up about where I want. I'll use some various magnets and such to do that, and then we'll resume. All right, so I've got the piece held into the body just with a couple of binder clips actually worked out. And then I was very careful and I centered the body, measured from side to side, from chassis to side, corner to corner, trying to make sure that everything is square. And then what I've done is fit a couple of weld tabs to the actual chassis. And these are a pretty simple little steel weld tab. I know the lighting isn't great, but I've got those mounted to the chassis currently, and then I've taken some spare TIG filler rod. This is just cheap material, so I like to use it to cut myself some just little scrap pieces, and then I can kind of use these as gauges to make sure that the pieces that I cut and put in place are going to be approximately the right length. So what I'm going to do is tie in from the rear corner of the chassis to the rear corner of where we made this first bar. I'm gonna handle the rear first, then we're gonna move to the front. Since I've determined this length here, now I'm gonna transfer that over into some steel tubing. Now I need to make sure that I leave it a little bit longer because I need to put a beveled edge onto it to tie in properly to the chassis side, and a little bit of a cope to fit to the upper tubes.
All right, so we're just looking solid as far as the rear hoop, the tie-in points to this rear corner at this point. I've got a good tack on everything. I fully welded the lower portion. I tacked them in place. You saw the smoke from the plastic there. Pulled it off, fully welded around the base. Then we moved up and I tacked the upper point. Now I need to determine where I'm going to make my mid or the forward point mounting. Now, being that I am welding, with the plastics in place, there's a good chance that I'm gonna damage these plastics, and at that point I will likely swap those out for new ones. All right, the hard part of this cage is done actually. The rear, this belt line bar basically is what I would call it, and the tie-ins to the cage. I think I'm only gonna tie it in these 4 places. So at this point, it's just bracing and adding style. I'll add my shock mounts, which is a little bit of work, but honestly, just once you get to this stage, it's only fun. It's just making sure that it looks the way you want and that everything flows with the body, and that's it. It's just, this is where the style of the cage is really going to come. I've only tack welded these front mounts, so I'm gonna pull this whole cage off, and then we're gonna finish weld around a couple of these joints. These rear ones too, I've only got half welded. So I'm gonna do that first because I imagine I'm gonna tie other joints into these areas, and I don't wanna cover up an unwelded joint before I start laying other pieces of tubing on top of it. All right, so the next bar I'm gonna put in is going to be I would say the most important visual bar, and that's going to be my C pillar, considering like an A, B, and C pillar. I think this one's gonna give the cage the most style. So I'm gonna go with it's a 45-degree bend, and I'm gonna put it into this flat area of the back of the cab. There's an angled portion here, and it kind of comes flat, and I'm gonna stick it right between that and the window. So it's gonna go through, I want the top of it to be parallel with the ground, and then I want it to tie into this bed rail. So I'm doing this first because then also I'm gonna try and tie into the tie-in point of this and that bed rail for my cross bracing to try and make everything as strong as possible. So I don't want to go doing a bunch of other bracing or anything else in the bed for the shock mounts until I get this bar put in place. Now I also need to give just a little bit of leeway to the fact that I want this to protrude into the cab. I've got the body like pulled away, and I've got the tube in place sticking through the body, and being that we're going to TIG weld, we've got a little bit of an advantage of speed on our hands. Obviously, it would be best to not do it with the body in place, but to try and match all of these points exactly, with trying to get the angle through the body and get it in the right spot for going through the body, all of that, do it the easy way with the body in place, and we're gonna try and just make sure not to hit the body with any heat. So, here we go. I'm welding at 40 amps. Here we go. All right, I got it tacked in place. I've got a water bucket with a damp cloth. Cool it down, make sure the heat doesn't end up somewhere in the body that we don't want it. Make sure that none of the tubes are too hot. And I think we're good. I will have to trim the body a little bit to make sure it clears that tube. Actually, leaving the extra length on that bottom piece helps because it kind of acts as a guide, and it works out. May add just a little bit more height to this. Bend it up a hair. Gets us a start at least, and then from there we can tweak and bend and just make sure everything pulls into where it's needed. So we're good. Okay, so I've got the main structure of the cage welded up. I've got the down bars in. I've got a single cross brace at the base of those C pillars, but now I'm starting to put in some of the bracing here. Now at this point, I'm gonna switch from the TIG over to the torch. These are gonna be the welds that are completely visible, not covered up by any of the railings, and I think that I can get the cleanest look with the torch rather than the TIG. Just using some silver solder and flux in these joints, hopefully we can get it to flow around quite well. Now I'm gonna do these top welds in place, and then I'm going to remove the cage and I'll start to do some of the other filler and things like that when it's out of the chassis itself. So that joint came out fine. Let's pull the chassis out of place and get that bottom joint welded up. You just want this real fine, it's called a neutral flame. So it's just this super bright blue point. After you polish it up with that sanding block, you end up with a pretty clean looking joint. Maybe use just a little bit more on that top side. It's a solid joint, but it just didn't fill in all the way.
So overall, I'm really happy with how this cage turned out. This one is one that I didn't start with much of a plan. The only plan that I had is that I knew I wanted to do a little bit different style as far as this down pillar. Rather than doing a bar that kind of went and did a traditional hoop in the back, I wanted one that was more pre-runner style, where they'll put them in through the actual body section and then tie it into an interior cage. Now, I don't have an interior cage in this, but that's the style that it's mimicking. From there, I just kind of kept going and I ended up with these pretty interesting shock mounts, a style different than what I've done in the past, but I'm actually really happy with. These tabs started out as a BPC tab, which is kind of a universal tab to be used for whatever you want. I cut it down, shaped it, and then I ended up adding a strap to the top to kind of give it that appearance of actually being much thicker. Now it's just a wide piece of 14 gauge sheet metal on top of it that gives it that appearance, but I think it made a big difference in the end. Now, these plates that I use for the shock mounts actually have a ton of holes along them. And I don't normally like using something that looks kind of with a bunch of shock mount holes. I think it just looks like you didn't necessarily plan out what you were trying to do. But this case, I actually think it kind of almost looks like a style thing rather than just a bunch of holes. So I'm somewhat okay with that. Most of this cage I ended up building with that Detroit torch. So I silver soldered most of it. I started with the TIG and just kind of built the initial bottom section and the tie-ins to the chassis. But then from there, everything else was pretty much done with the torch. And it was actually a lot of fun, something I hadn't done in a while, and I'm really happy I got back to that. I used silver solder that I got from Holmes Hobbies. Silver solder just flows so nice, using a little bit of flux, everything was just fantastic. So overall, this was a really fun experience. I haven't cleaned this thing up totally yet. I did media blast it at the office today earlier, but then came back, added a lot of these other details and parts and pieces here and there. So it still needs to be cleaned up as far as all of the extra, flux residue that's kind of hanging around. And then from there, I can also take and, sand some of the extra silver solder that kind of overflowed and just kind of get it down to just the joint area if I have time. I may not just spend a ton of time on that and just focus on getting major things done. So we'll see. Either way, there's not a ton, extra around, so it's nothing that's gonna look, bad. One other thing that I did is I built myself a real simple plate style rear bumper. I think for one, it's gonna give me metal bumper points for the rear, but two, I actually think that it looks good. It's got kind of a race Jeep style to it with that kick up in the back. Drilled a few holes in it, poorly spaced, but that and the addition of these panels back here off of the rear of the cage, and that is going to be to help support these rear, corners of the body. So that's where I'm going to add some Velcro or something like that after the body's painted to help hold everything in place so I don't get any flapping body corners. If I have time, there's a couple of things that I do want to do. These sliders actually work pretty decent, but I could move them in probably 1/4 of an inch per side, which is a decent amount of clearance when you're talking about a comp vehicle. So if I have time, I'll probably build myself some new rock sliders. If I have time, which is very, very unlikely. I knew exactly where the back of the cab was gonna be because I have a crossbar there. But when I was adding these shock tabs, I decided to leave them long, to let them continue into the cab of the vehicle. And I did that for a couple of reasons. Now, there's 3 additional holes that are like the shock mount holes, you know, behind that portion. And I decided that I wanted these in there because it'll give me the ability to mount a number of things that I think may be helpful for me. One is that I wanted to be able to make a piece that helps support the back side of the body, the underside of this rear window actually. And that's because right now I've got these tubes that go through the Lexan. And if you just leave it at that, you'll end up tearing that Lexan body in short order if you drive like I do. So I want to help keep that stress off the body just in that point. I want to support the bottom of that window. So I'm going to design up and 3D print something that's going to help cradle that lower portion. So downward forces are going to be partially transmitted through that area. I also want to try and reinforce around where those openings are with these tubes. And I'll probably do that again with some more 3D printed parts that'll bolt through the body. I still haven't installed that other inner fender panel that we created. I need to get that done. I need to get the, both sides permanently mounted. Currently this one's just kind of resting in there, which is not the proper way, obviously. I did position the shock mounts so that they raised the shock mounting position compared to the plastic stock shock mounts of the VS410. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, I do have that rear portal axle in this truck, and that raises that rear axle up 13 millimeters. So I wanted to raise that shock up to help keep my ride height down where I wanted. Now I can lower the shock down to the link mount holes as one option, but I moved it back up to the regular option and then just moved that shock up. I think that it gives me a little bit more style. Having those shock mounts a little bit further up kind of gives me this pre-runner-esque look that I was kind of envisioning, and I think that it worked out pretty well. With the shock position that I have at ride height, the rear lower links are actually going a little bit uphill, kind of the opposite of the way that a lot of people would have their trucks sitting, with the links kind of going down from the skid plate to the axle. But since I have all that clearance and I want to keep my ride height low, they go slightly uphill, which is very similar to some of my other portal axle vehicles that I've built. Now I don't have a ton of up travel before the axle hits this plastic cross brace. If I wanted to take out that plastic cross brace and build myself some simple tube style cross braces, I could do that. Right now, I'm not that interested in that process, because right now I'm thinking more along the lines of comp crawling, where up travel isn't that necessary. I do have some, so hitting a ledge and kind of bumping up is not going to be something that pitches me off and makes me completely unstable. But I've got plenty of flex either way. Just that up travel does start to get into that plastic. The base truck that this build started out as has a ton of hours into it, and I should probably open up the shocks, just freshen them up, maybe look at what oil I'm using, probably switch to somewhere between 60 and 90 weight oil, as that's kind of the norm that I've been running lately. Now, the little victory of getting all the tube work done is just one small check mark on the huge list of things that I have to get done in the next 20 or 21 days until Scale Nationals, but it's definitely one that I think is a milestone for me. From there, wiring, interior, trying to calculate how many scale points I have on these trucks, and making sure they function in general. Big items left on that list. One huge question that arose today while talking with Brandon is I need to get these trucks painted, and I gotta pick a paint color because I can't do orange. This truck has bronze wheels, which would look great with an orange body, not a problem at all. But the other two trucks, which I would like to match, all 3 of them in some way, they have got gold wheels on them, and gold and orange do not go together well. So I've got to pick a different color, and I don't know what to do. Orange was just gonna be my go-to. I mean, I guess I could change wheels on all 3 of them, but that sounds, I don't want to do that. So I've got to come up with a paint scheme, a color scheme, whatever that I'm going to try and match between the three. And I've got to find something that I can get in both PS and TS style paints. So that decision needs to happen. If you have any suggestions on very simple, paint schemes, color schemes, themes in general, let me know. I could use the help. I'll tell you this, with under 3 weeks left to go, I am already exhausted, but got to keep going. Every night, come home, get to work, and just try and get these trucks done. Fingers crossed. But with that, hit the like button before you leave. Subscribe if you're not already. Notification bell on so you see the videos as soon as they get uploaded. As always, thanks for watching, guys. I appreciate it. We'll see you on the next one.